Hey, welcome back to the archive. I am your host, the Eternal Archivist, and I do apologize for the delay in the recent videos. I've been a little under the weather, but we're back. Hooray! And again, before we get started, I do want to say be sure to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon so that I don't have to, haunt your dreams and haunt your pet's dreams, because I do it, and it's going to happen. So just be sure to like and subscribe, and I love you all. Alright, so for today's video, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite authors and one of his short stories that he wrote, H.P. Lovecraft. And the short story that we're going to be going over is The Shadow over Innsmouth. The Shadow over Innsmouth was written in early 1900s. To me, it's like one of those early stories, perfect blend of mystery and just weird, crazy stuff going on. So I really wanted to talk about it. I mentioned in my last video that I was going to go over and do a video like this. So that's what we're doing. That's what's going to be this week's video. We're going to go over The Shadow over Innsmouth. And it's not even really going to be me just reading the whole story. It's going to be more so of just me kind of going over a lot of important things in the story and kind of just, going over what we read. So I do hope you like it. If you don't like it, or if you want to see anything different in future videos, please be sure to comment. I'd love to, do anything that you guys have in mind. It'd be very, very cool to do that. But for today, let's go ahead and talk about The Shadow over Innsmouth. So let's take a stroll into the town. So our story begins with a report from the government about Innsmouth. So during the winter of 1927, officials of the federal government made a strange and secret investigation of certain conditions in the ancient Massachusetts seaport of Innsmouth. The public first learned of it in February, when a vast series of raids and arrests occurred, followed by the deliberate burning and dynamiting under suitable precautions of an enormous number of crumbling, worm-eaten, and supposedly empty houses along the abandoned waterfront. Uninquiring souls let this occurrence pass on as one of the major clashes in a war of liquor. So this did take place in the 1920s, so a lot of people thought that this giant raid on the town was just the prohibition. Keener followers of the news, however, wondered at the prodigious number of arrests, the abnormally large force of men used in making them, and the secrecy surrounding the disposal of the prisoners. No trials or even definite charges were reported, nor any of the captives seen thereafter in regular prisons of the nation. There were vague statements about disease and concentration camps, and later about dispersal of various naval and military prisons, but nothing positive ever developed. Innsmouth itself was left almost depopulated, and is even now only beginning to show signs of sluggishly revived existence. Complaints from many liberal organizations were met with long, confidential discussions, and representatives were taken on trips to certain camps and prisons. As a result, these societies became surprisingly passive and reticent. Newspapermen were harder to manage, but seemed largely to cooperate with the government in the end. Only one paper, a tabloid, always discounted because of its wild policy, mentioned the deep-diving submarine that discharged torpedoes downward into the marine abyss just beyond Devil's Reef. That item, gathered by chance in a haunt of sailors, seemed indeed rather far-fetched, since the low, black reef lies a full mile and a half out from the Innsmouth harbor. People around the country and in the nearby towns muttered a great deal amongst themselves, but said very little to the outside world. They have talked about dying in the half-deserted Innsmouth for nearly a century, and nothing new could be wilder or more hideous than what they had whispered and hinted years before. Okay, so that is the FBI or the government report over Innsmouth. And basically, what it covers is some kind of massive raid happened on the town. A huge force of policemen, even soldiers, raided the town, burned down lots of buildings, a lot of gunshots were heard, and there were even submarines and battleships sent to the harbor of this small town. And apparently, a lot of arrests were made, and a lot of people were killed. But the weird part about this report is no prisoners were ever seen or heard from after this massive raid from the government. So the story already is kind of starting off with this weird beginning of this town, small town in Massachusetts, getting raided by the government for seemingly no reason. And people are just kind of left wondering what's going on. And then whenever you have these groups that are making statements or kind of trying to dive into this and investigate, they're being picked up by the government and they themselves are being sent to prison or some kind of camp. So clearly something is being covered up by the government here. All right, so now that we've covered that initial report over Innsmouth from the FBI and the government, we get introduced now to our protagonist, who is an eyewitness to the events that happened in Innsmouth. So the whole viewpoint of this story, from our protagonist's viewpoint, is that of an eyewitness that was there and saw what happened. And their accounts begin with this. My contact with this affair has been closer than that of any other person, and I have carried away impressions which are yet to drive me to drastic measures. It was I who fled frantically out of Innsmouth in the early morning hours of July 16, 1927, and whose frightened appeals for government inquiry and action brought on the whole reported episode. I was willing enough to stay mute while the affair was fresh and uncertain, but now that it is an old story, with public interest and curiosity gone, I have an odd craving to whisper about those few frightful hours in that ill-rumored and evilly shadowed seaport of death and blasphemous abnormality. So that's our protagonist, basically letting us know that they were there, they saw it, they seen it, you know. So that's what this story is going to be, is their account. The official story begins. Our protagonist is celebrating their birthday. And they're celebrating their birthday with some sightseeing. So they're going to be traveling around the Massachusetts area. They're going to be traveling up to a town called Arkham. And the story begins with this. I never heard of Innsmouth till the day before I saw it for the first and, so far, last time. I was celebrating my coming of age by a tour of New England sightseeing, and I had planned to go directly from ancient Newburyport to Arkham, whence my mother's family was derived. I had no car, but was traveling by train, trolley, and motor coach. I was always looking for the cheapest possible route. In Newburyport, they told me that the steam train was the thing to take to Arkham, and it was only at the station ticket office that I demurred at the high fare. It was very expensive, and that's where I learned about Innsmouth. The stout, shrewd-faced agent, whose speech showed him to be no local man, seemed sympathetic towards my efforts at economy, and made a suggestion that none of my other informants had offered before. Well, you could take that old bus, I suppose, he said with certain hesitation. But it ain't thought much of here. It goes through Innsmouth, so the people don't like it. And the bus is run by an Innsmouth fella, Joe Sargent, but never gets any customers from here, or Arkham either, I guess. It's a wonder it keeps running at all. I suppose it's cheap enough, but I never see more than 2 or 3 people in it. Nobody but those Innsmouth people are ever on that bus. The bus leaves the front of Hammond's drugstore at 10 a.m. and 7 p.m., unless they've changed lately. Looks like a terrible rattletrap. I've never been on it before. That was the first I ever heard of shadowed Innsmouth. Any reference to a town not shown on common maps or listed in recent guidebooks would have interested me, and the agent's odd manner of allusion roused something like real curiosity in me. A town able to inspire such dislike in its neighbors, I thought, must be at least pretty unusual, and worthy of a tourist's attention. If it came before Arkham, then I definitely stopped there first. So, I asked the agent to tell me something about Innsmouth, and he was very deliberate. He spoke with an air of feeling slightly superior to what he said. So here's where we kind of get our first bit of exposition from the ticket taker at the bus stop. And he is going to talk about Innsmouth and its people to our protagonist. The protagonist, as we've already kind of covered, you know, looks like he's some 18-year-old kid. He's having his birthday, so he's celebrating his birthday by going sightseeing, checking out local towns. He doesn't have a lot of money. He was going to take the bus up to Arkham, and a guy is telling him, you know, yeah, it's super expensive, but if you take this super cheap bus, which stops in Innsmouth first, that'll get you to Arkham. So that's what this protagonist wants to do, or it sounds like that's what he's thinking about doing. So now he's asked our ticket taker about Innsmouth, to tell him something about Innsmouth, why people don't like it. So here we start to get our first bit of exposition, as I was saying, and here we go. So this is from the ticket taker. Innsmouth? Well, it's a queer kind of town, down at the mouth of the Menuet. Used to be almost a city, quite a port before the War of 1812, but it's all gone to pieces in the last 100 years or so. There's no railroad there since B&M never went through, and the branch line from Rowley has given up years ago. There's more empty houses than there are people, I guess, and there ain't no business to speak of except fishing and lobstering. Everybody trades mostly here or in Arkham. Once they had quite a few mills, but now they don't have anything. They do have one gold refinery running on the leanest kind of part-time. That refinery, though, used to be a big thing, and Old Man Marsh, the guy that owns it, he must be real rich. But he's a queer old duck, and he sticks mighty close to his home. He's supposed to have developed some skin disease or deformity late in life that makes him keep out of sight. He is the grandson of Captain Obed Marsh, who founded the business. His mother seems to have been some kind of foreigner, they say a South Sea Islander. So everybody raised hell whenever he married an Ipswich girl about 50 years ago. They always do that about Innsmouth people. Folks here always try to cover up any Innsmouth blood that they might have in them. But Marsh's children and grandchildren look just like anyone else as far as I can see. I've had them pointed out to me. Though, come to think of it, the elder children don't seem to be around lately, and I never saw the old man. Folks here have been telling things about Innsmouth, whispering them, mostly for the last 100 years, I guess, and I gather they're more scared than anything else. Some of the stories would make you laugh about old Captain Marsh driving bargains with the devil, bringing imps out of hell to live in Innsmouth, or about some kind of devil worship and awful sacrifice in some place near the wharves that people stumbled upon around 1845. But I came from Paynton, Vermont. That kind of story don't go down with me. You ought to hear, though, what some of the old-timers tell about the Black Reef off the coast. They call it the Devil's Reef. It's, well, above water a good part of the time, and never much below it, but at that you could hardly call it an island. The story is that there's a whole legion of devils seen sometimes on that reef, sprawled about, or darting in and out of some kind of caves near the top. It's a rugged, uneven thing, a good bit over a mile out, and toward the end of the shipping days, sailors used to make big detours just to try and avoid it. That is, sailors that didn't come from Innsmouth. One of the things they had against old Captain Marsh was that he would land on it sometimes at night when the tide was right. Maybe he did, for I dare say the rock formation is interesting. It's just barely possible he was looking for pirate loot, or maybe he was finding pirate loot, but there was talk of his dealing with demons down there. Fact is, I guess on the whole, it was really the captain that gave the bad reputation to the reef and to the whole town of Innsmouth. That was before the big epidemic of 1846, when over half the folks in Innsmouth were carried off. They never did quite figure out what the trouble was, but it was probably some foreign kind of disease brought from China or somewhere by the shipping. It surely was bad. There was riots over it, all sorts of ghastly doings that I don't believe ever got outside of the town, and it left the place in awful shape. It's never come back to what it used to be. More than 300 or 400 people were taken away. There's barely anybody there now. The place has always been badly cut off from the rest of the country by marshes and creeks, and we can't be sure about the ins and outs of the matter. But it's pretty clear that old Captain Marsh must have brought home some odd specimens when he had all three of his ships in commission back in the 20s and the 30s. There certainly is a strange kind of streak in Innsmouth, folks, today. I don't know how to explain it, but it sort of makes you crawl. You'll notice a little in Sargent if you take his bus. Some of the people from Innsmouth, have a queer, narrow head with flat noses and bulgy, starey eyes that never seem to shut. And their skin, it just isn't quite right. It's rough and scabby, and the sides of their necks are all shriveled or creased up. They get bald too, very young. The older fellers look the worst.
I don't believe I've ever seen a very old chap from Innsmouth, actually. They must die very young. Animals hate them too. They used to have lots of horse trouble before the automobiles came in. Nobody around here, or in Arkham, or even Ipswich will have anything to do with them. And they act kind of offish themselves whenever they come into town or whenever anyone tries to go fishing on their grounds. It's weird how fish are always super thick around Innsmouth Harbor when there ain't any fish anywhere else, but try to fish there yourself and see how the folks will chase you off. Those people used to come here on the railroad, walk in and talk in the train at Rowley after the branch had dropped off, but now they just use that nasty old bus. There's a hotel in Innsmouth too. It's called the Gilman House, but I don't believe it can amount to too much. I wouldn't advise you try it. You better stay over here and take the 10 o'clock bus tomorrow morning. Then you can get an evening bus from there to Arkham at 8 o'clock. There was a factory inspector who had stopped at that Gilman House a couple of years ago. He had a lot of unpleasant hints about the place. Seems like they got a queer crowd there. For this fellow heard voices in other rooms, though most of them were empty, and that gave him the shivers. He said it was foreign talk, he thought, but he said the bad thing about it was the kind of voice that sometimes spoke. It sounded so unnatural and slopping like. He said he didn't dare undress or even go to sleep. He just waited till the first light and then he took off. This fellow, Casey his name was, had a lot to say about the Innsmouth folks, and he said they watched them, and they always kind of seemed to be on guard. He found the Marsh refinery a queer place too. It's in an old mill on the lower falls of the Manuit. What he said tallied up with what I'd heard. Books in bad shape, no clear account of any kind of dealings. You know, it's always been a kind of mystery where the Marshes got the gold that they refine. They never seemed to do much buying in that line, but years ago they shipped out an enormous lot of ingots. Used to be talk of a queer foreign kind of jewelry that the sailors and refinerymen sometimes sold on the sly, or that was seen once or twice on some of the Marsh women folks. People thought maybe old Captain Obed traded for it in some port somewhere, especially since he was always ordering stacks of glass beads and trinkets, such as seafaring men used to do. Others thought, and still think, that he found some pirate catch, or found something out there on Devil's Reef. But here's the funny thing. The old captain's been dead these past 60 years, and there ain't been a good-sized ship out of the place since the Civil War. But just the same, the Marshes still keep on buying a few of those native trade things, mostly glass and rubber. That's what they tell me. Maybe the Innsmouth folk like them as jewelry. God knows they've got to be about as bad as South Sea cannibals or Guinea savages. Hell, that plague at 46 must have taken off the best blood in the place. Anyway, they're a doubtful lot now, and the Marshes and the other rich folks are as bad as any. I told you, there probably ain't more than 400 people in that whole town, in spite of all the streets they say that there are. I guess they're what they call white trash down south. Lawless and sly, and full of secret doings. They get a lot of fish and lobster, and they do exporting by truck. Queer how the fish swam right there and nowhere else. Nobody can ever keep track of that people in Innsmouth either. The state, school officials, and census men have a devil of a time, and you can bet that prying strangers are not welcome there either. I've heard personally of more than one business or government man that's disappeared going to Innsmouth, and there's loose talk of one who went crazy and is out at Danvers now. They must have fixed up some awful scare for that fellow. That's why I wouldn't go there at night if I was you. I'd never been there, and I have no wish to go, but I guess a daytime trip couldn't hurt you, even though the people hereabouts will advise you not to make it. If you're just sightseeing and looking for old-time stuff, Innsmouth ought to be quite the place for you. Okay, so yeah, that was a lot of exposition and a lot of talking. But yeah, so the ticket taker is basically talking about Innsmouth, talking about how or why a lot of the people or a lot of the neighboring towns don't like Innsmouth. I mean, they look very weird, apparently. They all kind of look like hillbillies, flat heads or skinny heads, flat noses. They have unblinking eyes and scabby skin. They just act super weird. There was a disease that wiped out almost half of the town. And then on top of all of that, Innsmouth seems to not have any source of income. They don't really have any money because everything's been closed down, but they have this gold refinery that's still producing gold ingots and still making a lot of money. And nobody knows how that gold refinery is still operating. So that's also a little interesting there. So as we go a little bit further into the story, our protagonist has decided to listen to the ticket seller because, the ticket guy was like, I wouldn't recommend going to Innsmouth at nighttime. It's a weird place. I've heard nothing but bad things. You should go there in the morning. So our protagonist has decided to do that. So he's going to spend the night in the town that he's currently at. And in the meantime, just to find something to do, he's going to walk around and visit the local library and the Historian Society so that he can find out anything on Innsmouth before he goes there. So as he went into the library, this is what he had to say. The Essex County histories on the library shelves had very little to say, except that Innsmouth was founded in 1643, noted for shipbuilding before the Revolution, a seat of great marine prosperity in the early 19th century, and later a minor factory center using the Minuet as power. The epidemic and riots of 1846 were very sparsely treated, as if they had formed a discredit to the county. References to the decline were few, though the significance of the latter record was unmistakable. After the Civil War, all industrial life was confined to the Marsh Refinery Company, and the marketing of gold ingots formed the only remaining bit of major commerce aside from the fishing. Most interesting of all was a glancing reference to the strange jewelry vaguely associated with Innsmouth. It had evidently impressed the whole countryside more than a little, for mention was made of specimens in the museum of the Miskatonic University at Arkham, and in the display room of the Newburyport Historical Society. Despite the relative lateness of the hour, I resolved to see the local sample of jewelry. So I went to the Historical Society so I could see the jewelry that had come out of Innsmouth. Miss Tilton of the Historical Society allowed me to access and see the jewelry. It took no excessive sensitiveness to beauty to make me literally gasp at the strange, unearthly splendor of the alien, opulent fantasy that rested there on a purple velvet cushion. Even now, I can hardly describe what I saw, though it was clearly enough a sort of tiara. As the description had said, it was tall in front and with a very large and curiously irregular periphery, as if designed for a head of almost freakishly elliptical outline. Miss Tilton, comparing all possible hypotheses regarding its origin and its presence in New England, was inclined to believe that it formed part of some exotic pirate horde discovered by Captain Obed Marsh. This view was surely not weakened by the insistent offers of purchase at a high price, which the Marshes began to make as soon as they knew of its presence, and which they repeated to this day despite the Society's unvarying determination not to sell it. As the good lady showed me out the building, she made it clear that the pirate theory of the Marshes' fortune was a popular one among the intelligent people of the region. Her own attitude towards Innsmouth, which she had never seen, was one of disgust at a community slipping far down the cultural scale, and she assured me that the rumors of devil worship were partly justified by a peculiar secret cult which had gained force there and engulfed all the Orthodox churches in the area. This cult was called the Esoteric Order of Dagon. It was undoubtedly a debased, quasi-pagan thing imported from the East a century ago, at a time when the Innsmouth fisheries seemed to be going dry. Its persistence among a simple people was quite natural in a view of the sudden and permanent return of abundantly fine fishing, and it soon came to be the greatest influence on the town, replacing Freemasonry altogether and taking up headquarters in the old Masonic Hall on New Church Green.
Alright, so basically what we just covered was, our protagonist has decided that they're going to stay in Newburyport, small town, overnight, and not go to Innsmouth because they were told not to go there at nighttime. And while they're waiting for the morning to head there, they decided to check out the local library and the local historian society because there are people talking about the jewelry that has come from Innsmouth, and it's very strange, weird jewelry. So he went to the local historian society so that he could check out this jewelry. And when he got there, he saw that it was crazy looking. It looks like it was made for it was a tiara that looked like it was made for a massive head. It just didn't look like it belonged on a human being's head. And the most important bit of information that our protagonist has also learned in the Historian Society is that Innsmouth has completely changed their religion in the town. They're no longer any Freemasons. They don't believe in any kind of Christianity or Catholicism. Now they have a cult that is called the Esoteric Order of Dagon. And this cult that has taken over the town, they pretty much control everything in the town. Everything is controlled by the Esoteric Order of Dagon. So now we go to the following morning. So now our protagonist has woken up, they're getting on with their day, and they are going to take the bus to Innsmouth so that they can spend their day in Innsmouth before heading out to Arkham. So let's go ahead and go into that. So as our protagonist goes back to the bus station in the morning so that he can head to Innsmouth, he sees that the old bus, that Innsmouth bus, has pulled up. So we're going to start with his description of the bus. There were only 3 passengers, dark, unkempt men of sullen visage and somewhat youthful, and when the vehicle stopped, they clumsily shambled out and began walking up the State Street in a silent, almost furtive fashion. The driver also departed, and I watched him as he went into the drugstore to make some purchase. This, I reflected, must be the Joe Sargent mentioned by the ticket agent, and even before I noticed any details, there spread over me a wave of spontaneous aversion, which could be neither checked nor explained. Oh, we have SCP popping into the video. I apologize. Hi, SCP. So back to the story. It suddenly struck me as very natural that the local people should not wish to ride on a bus owned and driven by this man, or to visit any oftener than possible the habitat of such a man and his kinsfolk. When the driver came out of the store, I looked at him more carefully and tried to determine the source of my evil impression. He was a thin, stoop-shouldered man, not much under 6 feet tall, dressed in a shabby blue civilian clothes and wearing a frayed gray golf cap. His age was perhaps 35, but the odd, deep creases in the sides of his neck made him seem older when one did not study his dull, expressionless face. He had a narrow head, bulging, watery blue eyes that seemed to never blink, and a flat nose. He had a receding forehead and chin, and singularly underdeveloped ears. His long, thick lip and coarse-pored grayish cheeks seemed almost beardless except for some sparse yellow hairs that straggled and curled in irregular patches. And in places the surface seemed queerly irregular, as if peeling from some cutaneous disease. His hands were large and heavily veined, and had a very unusual grayish-blue tinge. The fingers were strikingly short in proportion to the rest of the structure, and seemed to have a tendency to curl closely into a huge palm. As he walked towards the bus, I observed his peculiar shambling gait, and saw that his feet were inordinately immense. The more I studied them, the more I wondered how he could buy any shoes that fit them. A certain greasiness about the fellow increased my dislike. He was evidently given to working or lounging around the fish docks, and carried with him much of their characteristic smell. Just what foreign blood was in him, I could not even guess. Yet, I could see why the people found him alien. I myself would have thought of biological degeneration rather than alienage.
I was sorry when I saw that there would be no other passengers on the bus. Somehow I did not like the idea of riding alone with this man. But as leaving time obviously approached, I conquered my qualms and followed the man aboard, extending him a dollar bill and murmuring the single word, Innsmouth. Well, Jesus, dude, I mean, honestly, I'm not gonna lie, this guy just sounds like he doesn't like how these people look. I mean, let's be real here, just straight out the gate, he's just like, okay, they look weird, so I don't like them, and I can understand why other people don't like them, because they look greasy and they look weird. That's what he's saying. This sounds like a him problem, if I'm getting a little honest here. It sounds like this guy's just kind of a dick. So that as we continue the story, our protagonist has now boarded the bus to travel to Innsmouth, and the bus driver is a very weird looking guy. He's shambling. He's almost looks like a mutant, and the passengers that were on the bus that came from Innsmouth also looked just weird and gross. So now the bus has left Newburyport and it's traveling to Innsmouth. And here's where our story gets a little bit funner, since we're finally getting there. So let's go ahead and continue our story with our protagonist arriving to Innsmouth. All right, so this is going to be our protagonist arriving to Innsmouth and describing, the scenery and the people or children that they see as they arrive into the town. We met no one on the road, but presently began to pass deserted farms in varying stages of ruin. Then I noticed a few inhabited houses with rags stuffed in the broken windows and shells and dead fish lying about the littered yards. Once or twice I saw listless-looking people working in barren gardens or digging clams on the fishy-smelling beach below, and groups of dirty, simian-visaged children playing around weed-grown doorsteps. Somehow these people seemed more disquieting than the dismal buildings, for almost every one had certain peculiarities of face and motions which I instinctively disliked without being able to define or comprehend them. Jesus Christ. This guy he's just right out the gate. He can't even describe or comprehend why he dislikes these people, but he dislikes these people because they look weird. For a second, I thought this typical physique suggested some picture I had seen, perhaps in a book, under circumstances of particular horror or melancholy, but this pseudo-recollection passed very quickly. Now came signs of a sparse habitation, curtained windows here and there, an occasional battered motor car at the curb. Pavement and sidewalks were increasingly well defined, and though most of the houses were quite old wood and brick structures of the early 19th century, they were obviously kept fit for habitation. The bus had come to a sort of open concourse or radial point, with churches on two sides of the bedraggled remains of a circular green in the center. And I was looking at a large pillared hall on the right-hand junction ahead. The structure's once white paint was now gray and peeling, and the black and gold sign on the pediment was so faded that I could only with difficulty make out the words Esoteric Order of Dagon. This was the former Masonic Hall, now given over to the cult. As I strained to decipher this inscription, my notice was distracted by a raucous tone of a cracked bell across the street, and I quickly turned to look out the window of my side of the coach. The door of the church's basement was open, revealing a rectangle of blackness inside, and as I looked, a certain object crossed, or seemed to cross, that dark rectangle, burning into my brain a momentary conception of nightmare, which was all the more maddening because analysis could not show a single nightmarish quality in it. It was a living object, the first except the driver that I had seen since entering the compact part of the town, and I had been in a steadier mood, or had I been in a steadier mood, I would have found nothing whatever of terror in it. Clearly, as I realized a moment later, it was just the pasture. clad in some peculiar vestments, doubtless introduced since the Order of Dagon had modified the ritual of the local churches. The thing which had probably caught my first subconscious glance and supplied the touch of bizarre horror was the tall tiara the pastor wore, an almost exact duplicate of the one Miss Tilton had shown me the previous evening. All right, so our protagonist has arrived in Innsmouth. Take aside the fact that they're just kind of mean and they're going to talk shit about people just because they look a little differently, because that's all they've said so far about all these people. They look greasy, so I don't like them. That aside, they pulled into the town, and the Order of Dagon has taken over the town as far as the church. And he kind of, looked out the bus. He saw that there was a door open, freaked out for a second, and it was just the head of the church walking out. But the weird thing is the head of the church is wearing the tiara, that strange tiara that our protagonist saw in the Historic Society at Newburysport. As the protagonist leaves the bus, they decided to explore and find someone that they can speak with. So they're looking around Innsmouth, trying to kind of meet the locals or find someone they can talk to. And when they do that, they meet a young boy working at the local grocery store. And this boy does not live in Innsmouth. He actually lives outside of the town. He just has to drive there or travel there for his job. So this boy explains to the protagonist that the people of Innsmouth are very strange, and it is not best to speak with the locals or to be out at nighttime at all. The boy does mention that the town drunk has plenty of stories to tell, but they aren't very believable, and he then goes on to make a map of the town for the protagonist so that they can walk around and, kind of figure out what's going on with this town that they've heard so many rumors about. So now I'm going to go into there is a conversation between the protagonist and the boy that works at the grocery store. So I'm going to go into that conversation here. For some reason or other, I chose to make my first inquiries at the chain grocery store. I found a solitary boy of about 17 in charge, and I was pleased to note that the brightness and affability which promised cheerful information. He seemed exceptionally eager to talk, and I soon gathered that he did not like the place, its fishy smell, or its furtive people. A word with any outsider was a relief to him. He hailed from Arkham, boarded with a family who came from Ipswich, and went back home whenever he got a moment off. His family did not like him to work in Innsmouth at all, but the chain had transferred him there, and he did not wish to give up the job. There was, he said, no public library or chamber of commerce in Innsmouth, but I could probably find my way about. The street I came down was Federal. West of that was the fine old residence, streets Broad Washington, Lafayette, and Adams, and east of it were the shoreward slums. It was in these slums along Main Street that I would find the old Georgian churches, but they were all long abandoned. It would be well not to make oneself too conspicuous in such neighborhoods, especially north of the river, since the people were sullen and hostile. Some strangers had even disappeared. Certain spots were almost forbidden territory, as he had learned at considerable cost. One must not, for example, linger much around the Marsh refinery, or around any of the still-used churches, or around the pillared Order of Dagon Hall at the New Church Green. Those churches were very odd, and all violently disavowed by their respective denominations elsewhere, and apparently using the queerest kind of ceremonies and clerical vestments. As for the Innsmouth people, the youth hardly knew what to make of them. Their appearance, especially those staring, unwinking eyes which one never saw shut, was certainly shocking enough, and their voices were disgusting. It was awful to hear them chanting in their churches at night, and especially during their main festivals or revivals, which fell twice a year on April 30th and October 31st. They were very fond of the water, and swam a great deal in both river and in the harbor. Swimming races out to Devil Reef were very common, and everyone in sight seemed well able to share in this arduous sport. When one came to think of it, it was genuinely only rather young people who were seen out in public. And these, the oldest, were apt to be the most tainted looking. When exceptions did occur, they were mostly persons with no trace of aberrancy, like the old clerk at the hotel. One wondered what became of the bulk of the older folk, and whether the Innsmouth look were not a strange and insidious disease phenomenon which increased its hold as the years advanced. Only a very rare affliction, of course, could bring about such vast and radical anatomical changes in a single individual after maturity, changes involving osseous factors as basic as the shape of the skull. But then, even this aspect was no more baffling and unheard of than the visible features of the malady as a whole. It would be hard, the youth implied, to form any real conclusions regarding such a matter, since one never came to know the natives personally, no matter how long one might live in Innsmouth. The youth was certain that many specimens, even worse than the worst visible ones, were kept locked indoors in some places. People sometimes heard screams. It would be of no use, my informant said, to ask the locals anything about the place. The only one who would talk was a very old but normal-looking man who lived at the poorhouse on the north rim of town and spent his time walking about or lounging around the fire station. This character, Zadok Allen, was 96 years old and somewhat touched in the head. Besides being the town drunk, he was a strange, furtive creature who constantly looked over his shoulder as if afraid of something, and when sober, could not be persuaded to talk at all with strangers. He was, however, unable to resist any offer of his favorite poison, and once drunk, he would furnish the most astonishing tales. The youth told me about the businesses, how the abundance of fish was certainly almost uncanny in this town, but the natives were taking less and less advantages of it. Moreover, prices were falling and competition was growing. Of course, the town's real business was the gold refinery, whose commercial office was on the square, only a few doors down. Old Man Marsh has never been seen, but sometimes he would go to work in a closed curtain car. There were all sorts of rumors about how Marsh had come to look. He had once been a great dandy, and people said he still wore the frock-coated finery of an Edwardian age, curiously adapted to certain deformities. His sons had formerly conducted the office in the square, but lately they had been keeping out of sight a good deal and leaving the brunt of the affairs to the younger generation. The sons and their sisters had come to look very strange, especially the older ones, and it was said that their health was failing. One of the Marsh daughters was a repellent, reptilian-looking woman who wore an excess of weird-looking jewelry, clearly the same exotic tradition as to which the strange tiara belonged to. My informant had noticed it many times and had heard it spoken of as coming from some secret horde, either of pirates or of demons. The clergymen or priests or whatever they were called nowadays also wore this kind of strange jewelry.
Alright, so now we're getting a little bit more exposition as to what's going on in Innsmouth. So our protagonist has found a dude at a local grocery store, and they've been talking about Innsmouth so that the protagonist can learn more about it. And the local, or the guy at the grocery store, has basically said, all the locals have this weird deformity. They all look strange. They all have this health issue. You don't see any of the older people walking around. You only see the young people walking around. And people are seen wearing this strange jewelry all around town as well. He's also stated that there are places in Innsmouth that are so hostile that you cannot go there alone, or else you'll end up going missing. And that it's unknown where this disease or deformity of all these people is coming from. So the protagonist then decides that they're going to explore Innsmouth and see if they can talk to any of the locals. They use the map that the guy from the grocery store gave them to walk around, explore the town. As they're walking around, they see that the town is horribly, destroyed. I mean, it's just in shambles. They hear a bunch of creepy noises coming from shuttered up buildings and wooded up buildings, and it's just bad.
So any of the people that they do try to talk to, they either are just very mean and aggressive, or they just outright ignore the protagonist. So the protagonist gets to a point where they're so fed up with this town and how weird it is that they're just going to leave. They're done. They're like, you know what, that's not even worth being here. So they decide that they're going to go back to the bus station. And on their way back to the bus station, they happen to spot the town drunk Zadok that the grocery guy mentioned before. The guy that, he's the local town drunk. He talks a lot if you get him drunk. So our protagonist decides, I'm going to buy this guy a bottle of liquor, and I'm going to see if I can get him to tell me about this town. And that's what our next part is going to be about, is, he finds the town drunk, and he's going to see if he can get some stories. Shuffling out of Payne Street around the corner of the Gilman house, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle of liquor, and soon realized that he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street on my way to the most deserted region I could find. After hours of drinking with Zadok and almost finishing the bottle, Zadok finally began to speak. He bent toward me, took hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. So, right here, before I get started, I do want to say this is going to be like the largest amount of exposition so far. Zadok is the town drunk, so he's about to go off on a spiel. He's going to go off on a whole tale here, so I just want to prep you for that. But let's go ahead and hop into what Zadok has to tell our protagonist. That's where it all began. That cursed place of all wickedness where the deep water starts. Gate to hell, sheer drop down to a bottom that no line can touch. Old Captain Obed did it. He who found out more than was good for him in the South Sea Islands. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade was falling off. Mills were losing business, even the new ones. And the best of our menfolks were killed privateering in the War of 1812, or lost at sea. Obed Marsh, he had 3 ships still afloat, the Columbia, the Hetty, and the Symmetry Queen. He was the only one that kept on with the East Indian and the Pacific trade. No one was ever like Captain Obed, that old limb of Satan. I can remember him talking about foreign places and calling all the townsfolk stupid for going to Christianity and bearing their burdens meek and lowly. Obed said they should get better gods, like some of the folks in the Indies. Gods that would bring them good fishing in return for their sacrifices, and would really answer folks' prayers whenever they prayed to him. Matt Elliott was Captain Obed's first mate, and he talked a lot too. Only, he was against folks going against Christian beliefs. He talked about an island east of Othelette where there was a lot of stone ruins, older than anybody knew. There was a little volcanic island near there too, where there were other ruins with different carvings. The ruins all wore away like they had been under the sea once, and with pictures of awful monsters all over them. Well, sir, Matt said to Captain Obed, the natives around here all had the fish they could catch, and sported bracelets and armlets and head rigs made out of strange kind of gold and covered with pictures of monsters just like the ones carved over the ruins on that other island. Some sort of fish-like frogs or frog-like fish that were drawn on all kinds of positions like they were human beings. Nobody could get the islanders to tell them where they got all their stuff, and all the other natives wondered how they managed to find fish in plenty even when the very next islands had none. So, First Mate Matt, he began to wonder, and so did Captain Obed. Obed noticed that lots of the handsome young folks would drop out of sight for good from year to year, and that there wasn't many old folks around at all. Also, Obed thinks some of the folks looked very strange, even for islanders. It took Obed a while to get the truth out of them heathens. I don't know how he did it, but he began by trading for the gold-like things that they wore. He would ask them where they came from and if they could get more, and finally he got the story out of their old chief Wallachia. Nobody but Obed would have ever believed that old devil, but the captain could read folks like they were books. Captain Obed, he learned that there's things on this earth that most folks have never heard about and wouldn't believe even if they did. It seems these islanders were sacrificing heaps of their young men and women to some kind of god things that lived under the sea, and they were getting all kinds of favors in return. They met the god things on the little island with the strange ruins, and it seems the awful pictures of the frogfish monsters were supposed to be pictures of the gods. Perhaps they were the kind of creatures that got all the mermaid stories and such started. They had all kinds of cities on the sea bottom, and this island, it was heaved up from the bottom of the sea. Seems there was some of the things alive in the stone buildings when the island came up to the surface, and that's how the islanders found out they were there. They spoke to them using sign language as soon as they got over being afraid of them, and the islanders soon struck up a bargain with the gods before long. The godlike beings liked human sacrifices, and they had them going for ages before. But they lost track of the upper world after a long time. What they do to the victims, it isn't for me to say, and I guess Captain Obed wasn't none too sharp about asking. But it was all right with the islanders because they'd been having a hard time and were desperate about everything. They gave a certain number of young folks to the sea things twice a year, every year, May Eve and Halloween. What the things agreed to give in return was plenty of fish. They would drive them all up to the islands, and they would give us gold now and then. The natives met the things on the little volcanic island, going there in canoes with the sacrifices, and then they would bring back gold and fish. At first, the things didn't ever go on to the main island, but after a time they came to want to. Seems they desired to mix with the islanders and have joint ceremonies on the big days, May Eve and Halloween. You see, they were able to live both in and out of water. They was what you call amphibians, I guess. The Kanickis told them that the folks from the other islands might want to wipe them out if they got wind of their being there. But the god thing said that they don't care much, because they could wipe out the whole brood of humans if they wanted to. Any that didn't have any certain signs, such as the ones used by the lost old ones, whoever they were. But not wanting to bother with it, they would just lay low whenever anybody would visit the island. When it came to mating with the fish things, the god things, the islanders refused at first. But finally, they learned something that gave them a new perspective on the matter. It seems that the humans have got a kind of relation to these water creatures, since everything alive came from the water once. It only needs a little change to go back again. The creatures told the islanders that if they mixed blood, there would be children that looked human at first, but later they would turn more and more like the things, until finally they'd take to the water and join the main lot of the creatures down in the ocean. And this is the important part. The people that turned into fish things and went into the water, they would never die. The things couldn't die unless they were violently killed. It seems by the time Captain Obed met the islanders, they were all full of fish blood, and they were from the deep. When they got old and began to show it, they would hide until they felt like going to the water. Some were more changed than others. Some never did change quite enough to go into the water, but for the most part, they turned out exactly the way the creatures said they would. Those that were born more like the creatures changed early, but those that were nearly human sometimes stayed on the island until they were past 70, though they'd usually go down under for trial trips before that. Folks that had gone to the water generally came back in a good deal to visit, so a man would often be talking to his 5 times great-grandfather who left the dry land a couple hundred years ago. The islanders forgot about the idea of dying, except in canoe wars with the other islanders, or as sacrifices to the sea gods down below. They thought that what they had gained was well worth what they had to give up. And I guess Captain Obed came to the same conclusion himself whenever he thought over old Walachia's story. Wallachia, though, was one of the few islanders that didn't have any fish blood mixed in, since he was part of the royal line. Lekia showed Captain Obed a lot of rites and incantations that had to do with the sea things, and would let Obed see some of the folks in the village that had changed a lot from their human shape. Somehow or other, though, Lekia would never let Captain Obed see one of the creatures from the water. In the end, Lekia gave Captain Obed a funny kind of trinket made out of lead or something that he said would bring up the creatures from any place in the world, any place in the water. The idea was to drop it down where they were and they would come up after the right kind of prayers. Lekia claimed that the creatures were scattered in the oceans all over, so anybody that looked for them could find the nest and bring them up. Now, First Mate Matt didn't like this business at all, and he wanted Captain Obed to keep away from the island, but the captain was greedy for wealth and found out that he could get the gold-like trinkets so cheap it would benefit him to make a business out of it. Things went on that way for years, and Captain Obed got enough of the gold-like trinkets that he could start a refinery in the old town mill. He didn't sell the pieces like they were, since folks would start to ask questions. All the same, his crew would get a piece and they would dispose of it now and then, even though they was swore to keep quiet. He let some of his wife and daughters that looked more human wear some of the trinkets. Then we come to 1838, when I was 7 years old. Captain Obed found out that the island people were all wiped out. Seemed the other islanders had found out what was going on and took matters into their own hands. They were all wiped out with no trace of their bodies or the gold anywhere. That naturally hit Captain Obed pretty hard, seeing as his normal trade was doing very poor. It hit the whole community of Innsmouth as well, because in seafaring days, what profited the master of the ship profited the crew and their families. Most of the folks around town took the hard times like sheep and gave up, but they were in bad shape because the fishing was all running out and the mills were all shutting down. All that was left was the gold refinery. That's when Captain Obed began cursing at the people of Innsmouth for being dull sheep and for praying to a Christian heathen that didn't help him at all. He told them that he knew of people that prayed to gods and the gods would give them something back. Captain Obed said if a few good men would stand by him, he could get a hold of certain powers that could bring plenty of fish and plenty of gold. Of course, those that served on the Summitry Queen and saw the islands knew exactly what he was talking about, and they weren't too anxious to get close to the sea things like they had heard about. But those that didn't know about the islanders or the godlike sea creatures got swayed by what Captain Obed had said, and they began to ask him what he could do to set them on the right way. Poor First Mate Matt. He was always against it, and he tried to get the folks on his side. He had long talks with the preachers, which was of no use. Don't believe me? Then tell me, young man, why did Captain Obed and 20 other folks use to row out to the Devil's Reef in the dead of night and chant things so loud you could hear them all over town when the wind was right? Tell me that, and tell me, why did Captain Obed always drop heavy things into the deep water on the other side of the reef, where the bottom shoots down like a cliff? And tell me what he did with that funny-shaped lead trinket that Lekia gave him. And what did they all howl on May Eve, and then again on Halloween? Why did the new church followers that used to be sailors under Captain Obed start wearing them strange robes and cover themselves in the gold-like trinkets that Obed brought to town? You're beginning to see. Maybe you would have liked to be me in those days. When I saw things at night out at sea from the top of my house, oh, I can tell you, little kids have big ears, and I didn't miss anything that was gossiped about Captain Obed and the folks out on the reef. How about the night I took my father's spyglass up to the roof and I saw the reef bristling thick with shapes that dove into the water as soon as the moon would rise. Captain Obed and the folks were in a boat, but the shapes dove off the far side into the deep water and never came back up. How would you like to be a kid alone on the roof watching these shapes that weren't human? And suppose one night you saw something heavy thrown over the side of Captain Obed's boat beyond the reef, and then learned that the next day a young boy was missing from home. Did anyone ever see hide or hair of Hiram Gilman again? Did they? Or Nick Pierce? Or Lily Waite? Or Adenorn Southwick? Or Henry Garrison? The shapes spoke sign language with their hands, those that had real hands. That was the time that Captain Obed began to get on his feet again. Folks would see his 3 daughters wearing the gold-like trinkets that they never used to wear, and smoke started coming out of the gold refinery again. Other folks were prospering too. Fish began to swarm into the harbor, fit to kill. And heaven knows what size cargoes we began to ship out of the Newbury port and Arkham. It was then that Obed got the old branch railroad put through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the fish all and came in droves, but they all went missing. Nobody ever saw them again. And then our folks organized and created the Esoteric Order of Dagon and bought the Masonic Hall. First mate Matt Elliott was a Freemason, and he was against the selling of the Masonic Hall, but he dropped out of sight, and Matt was never seen again. Remember, I'm not saying Captain Obed was set on having things exactly how it was on the island. I don't think he aimed at first to mix bloodlines with the sea creatures, or to raise young ones that would eventually take to the water and turn into fish creatures with eternal life. He wanted the gold, and he was willing to pay heavy for it. And I guess the others were satisfied for a while. In the year 1846, much of the town began to think for themselves. Too many folks were missing. Too much strange preachings at meetings. Too much talks about that Devil Reef. I tried to help by telling Policeman Mowry what I saw on the roof one night. There was a party one night that followed Captain Obed's group out to the reef. I heard gunshots, and the next day, Captain Obed and 32 others were put in jail by the police, with everybody wondering what was going to happen. A couple of weeks later, when nothing had been dropped into the sea for that long, an awful, awful night came. That's when I saw them. I was up on the roof. Hordes of them, swarms of them, were all over the reef and swimming up the harbor into the town. God, what happened in the streets of Innsmouth that night? They rattled our door, but my father wouldn't open it. Then he went out the kitchen window with his musket to find Policeman Mowry to see what he could do. Mounds of the dead and the dying, shots and screams and shouting. The jail was thrown open. Treason, they called it. They called it the plague when the folks came in and found half of our people were dead and almost the entire town was destroyed. Nobody was left but those that joined up with Captain Obed. I never heard from my pa or found his body ever again. Captain Obed then took charge and said that things were going to change. Others will worship with us at meeting time, and certain houses will entertain guests. They wanted to mix blood like the Islanders did, and Obed didn't try to stop them. Too far gone was Obed. They brought us fish and treasures. Nothing was to be different on the outside. We were to keep shy of strangers, and we knew what was good for us. We all had to take the oath of Dagon, and later on there was a second and third oath that some of us took. There was no use fighting, for there were millions of them down there. They'd rather not start raising up and wiping out humankind, but if they wanted to, they could destroy all of humanity. God, what I've seen when I was 15, they would have killed me long ago for all that I know, but I've taken the first and the second oaths of Dagon, so I'm protected unless a jury of them proved that I said things to strangers deliberately. But I wouldn't take the third oath. I'd die rather than take that. And it got worse around the Civil War. The children born around 46 began to grow up, some of them that is. I never did any further prying after that awful night, and I never saw one of them up close in all my life, at least never a full-blooded one. I went to the war, and if I'd had any guts or sense I would never have come back, but settled far away from here. But folks would write to me, saying that things weren't so bad, and I suppose it was because the government draft men were in town after '63. After the war, it was just as bad again. People began to fall off mills and shops shut down. Shipping stopped over, the harbor was closed down, and the railroad got closed up. More and more and more. In '46, Captain Obed took a second wife that nobody in the town ever saw. Some say he didn't want to, but he was made to by the godlike creatures. He had 3 children with her. 2 disappeared very young, but 1 girl looked like a regular person, and they were sent to Europe. Obed finally got her married off to some man in Arkham. Barnabas Marsh, that runs the refinery now, is Obed's grandson by his first wife, son of Oniferous, his oldest son. but his mother was another of them that was never seen outside. Right now, Barnabas is about changed. He can't shut his eyes anymore, and it's all off shape. They say he still wears clothes, but he'll take to the water soon. He hasn't been seen in public in about 10 years. Woo! Alright, yeah, so that was the longest exposition throughout the story. My lord. Zadok had a lot to say. So if you stuck around, give yourself a pat on the back, because that was a lot. No, I do find it hilarious that this town literally is like super secretive, and they have this town drunk that they let wander around, and if you get him drunk enough, he'll just spill all the beans, and they just don't care. That's just crazy. So basically, our protagonist, they found Zadok, the town drunk. They asked him about what's going on with the town. Zadok, just to give you a quick summary, basically says, when this town was founded, we were basically shippers and mariners, and that's where we made all of our money. And Captain Obed was one of the very first sea captains in this town. He found an island with islanders, obviously, and they were worshiping these sea gods and doing sacrifices to the sea gods, and the sea gods in return were giving them fish and gold. So Captain Obed figured out how to basically join this religion, and he brought that back with him to Innsmouth, and now Innsmouth worships these sea gods. And another part of that religion is the mixing of blood. So children being born in this town are basically like sea creature children. It's just crazy. Yeah. But towards the end of that, Zadok starts to freak out of nowhere. Just randomly, Zadok starts to scream. He thinks that he's being watched, and he sprints away from our protagonist. So our protagonist is kind of left sitting there just like, what the hell just happened? That guy is nuts. So now we're getting towards the end of the story, and our protagonist journeys back to the town square so that they can wait for the bus to take him to Arkham. They just got done talking to Zadok. He gave him a crazy story, ran off, so they're pretty much finished with Innsmouth. They go back to the town square, they want to leave. The bus driver, whenever the bus arrives, gets out and says that the bus is having mechanical issues, and it's not going to be able to be fixed until morning. So our protagonist is going to need to stay at the local hotel. And this is where the story gets, this is where we get our thriller, our action, I guess is what you'd call it, but this is where the spice comes into the story. But the protagonist pays for a room, and, the people at this hotel are very strange. They're just like the fish people around the village. He pays for a room and goes up, locks his door, pushes the wardrobe up against his door, and lays down in his room, kind of getting ready to go to sleep. He keeps hearing noises, and he keeps hearing people, creeping and kind of walking around his room and whispering and saying things. And then he starts to notice that people are literally trying to open his door and get into his room. So at this point, it's where the fight or flight kicks in. He's like, oh shit, they are now actually trying to get into my room. It's going down. So our protagonist basically exits his room through a joining doorway, goes out into another room, and opens a window and jumps onto a roof of a neighboring building, because now he feels like he's about to get attacked by these people in the town. And as he jumps over to the neighboring building, he sees there is a large group of Innsmouth locals in the hotel, all trying to find him. So obviously something is going down. He makes it down to street level, and this is where he really wants to escape the town. This is like, things are going crazy. The town is now looking for him. All these creepy fish people are trying to find him. So he needs to get out. So he, after making it to ground level, he is now trying to weave himself through the town. And he's pretty successful by pretending to have a weird gait and acting like he's one of the Innsmouth locals. So he kind of does a zombie walk and is able to make himself pretty far outside of the town. He almost gets caught when he makes it to the railroad station, because there's a large group of the Innsmouth locals, and he describes them as being just horrible looking fish monstrosities and he actually ends up going unconscious because of just how they look. They just make him freak out and go unconscious. He wakes up a few hours later. He's still out in the middle of this like field where he passed out. So he begins to run, and he's running through the marshes and the creeks, and eventually he does make his way to Arkham. And Arkham was the town that he was trying to get to originally before he stopped off in Innsmouth. So the protagonist makes it to Arkham, and they tell the local authorities of what transpired, what happened the previous night, of this entire town trying to basically find him and kill him. The government is called in, and the protagonist explains to them exactly what happened. We don't really get a great description of what happened once the government arrives. This is kind of where the beginning of the story starts, where we get that official report from the government. That's kind of where you can get those details. And by that official report, we can conclude that after our protagonist got to the town and told the government and the police what was happening, they then went to Innsmouth, and a battle ensued. Buildings were set on fire, multiple people were shot, many policemen and soldiers were killed. They even fired torpedoes into Devil's Reef, which, if you remember from this story, that's where Captain Obed did a lot of his ceremonies. And it seems to be that's where a lot of these sea creatures are living, is in Devil's Reef. So the government attacked Devil's Reef, they attacked Innsmouth, burned everything down to the ground, and they're kind of covering up the entire thing. So that's where that first initial report comes from. And this is basically the whole short story of what happened in Innsmouth. Is, they went to this town, discovered all this crazy shit about the town, and then as they went to their hotel, the townsfolk tried to break into his room. He makes it down to the ground, and the entire town is looking for him, and he makes it out. Now, so the book does kind of let you know about what happened a few years after the incident. So a few years after the incident, the protagonist seems to be kind of going insane due to the nightmares that they've been having of having escaped Innsmouth. They decide that they're going to visit a historical society at Arkham so that they can learn more about Innsmouth and kind of get some closure of the whole thing, because it's just freaking them out. They're having these nightmares. They end up learning that they are in fact related to the Marsh family. So Obed Marsh, the people that own the gold refinery and the people that turned all of Innsmouth into this religion, he's related to that family. So, and he's related on his mother's side, and that his uncle had visited Innsmouth years prior, but ended up killing himself shortly afterward. Our protagonist also learns of a cousin that had gone to Innsmouth just a few months ago, but they're now locked up in an insane asylum. And as time goes on, our protagonist realizes more and more about, his family's relation to the Marshes. He's actually very closely related to them. And he continues to have more and more nightmares of his visit to Innsmouth. And the book ends with the protagonist breaking their cousin out of an asylum, and both of them traveling back to Innsmouth so that they can swim down to the Devil's Reef and join their family. So that's the full story of The Shadow over Innsmouth. It is, keep in mind, this book was written early 1900s, so if it sounds like a story that you might have heard before, or if many other stories sound like it, that's why. It's ancient. But I think it's a great story. It's a great little mystery story. It is a short story. It's about 60 pages long. I mean, I think that this was a solid look into the short story. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments, and I can do more stories about this in the future. I think for a scary story written before the 1920s, this is a solid piece of work. The world building of Innsmouth is amazing, and it has great suspense throughout the entirety of the novel. The ending, in my opinion, leaves a bit to be desired, but the story overall gets like a 6.5 rating from me. I feel like they could have had more things happen in the end. We just kind of, if we look at our story as a summary, we just have our protagonist, it's his birthday, he wants to go out on a road trip, he learns about this weird, creepy town, okay, he ends up going to the weird, creepy town, all the people are weird and creepy, He, meets a drunk guy that tells him that these people are basically worshiping sea gods and crazy people, and then the entire town goes crazy and tries to attack him, and he has to escape from the town. And that's our short story. But other than that, I think it was fun. But hey, this has been a great episode. Thank you guys so much for joining, and if you stayed till the end, I love you so much. I might start throwing in a couple of bonus content at the end just to reward you guys for staying on for the entire video. But thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you on our next trip into the archive.